Black woman doctor, mistaken for a janitor. Hospital refused her access to ICU until the truth erupted. Ma'am, you can't be back here. This area is restricted to medical personnel only. The guard's voice echoed down the sterile white hallway of the ICU, more like a scripted policy announcement than a human sentence. His polished brown shoes clicked firmly on the epoxy floor as he stepped directly in front of the woman approaching. She didn't respond. Instead, she calmly reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a chip-enabled ID badge, holding it up without a word. Dr. Alana Brooks, the badge read clearly, complete with a headshot and a federal medical certification seal. The middle-aged security guard barely glanced at it before casting a doubtful look over her natural curls, long coat, faded jeans, and worn sneakers. Ma'am, he repeated, firmer now. I said this area is for doctors and certified personnel only. Please return to the lobby. That just then, a young nurse peeked out from the ICU door, squinted toward Alana, and whispered to a colleague, I think she's one of the janitors. We've had a few try to sneak into ICU when short-staffed. Alana heard every word. Still, she didn't react. She stepped back, pulled out her phone, and quickly dialed a number. Yes, it's me. I'm here at St. Victor. I need access to ICU 4. They're blocking me. Yes, I'll hold. On the other end of the call was a familiar voice, Dr. Meredith Langley, chief of medicine at the hospital, and someone who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Alana through 36 sleepless hours in flood-ravaged Louisiana 3 years earlier. But before anyone could confirm her identity, alarms blared from inside the ICU. Emergency. A patient was crashing. That patient was Raymond Lee, Alana's adoptive father and a retired hospital executive. He had called her from his hospital bed just this morning, asking her to come immediately, insisting she be involved in his emergency intervention. Now, the one person he trusted with his life, the only one authorized for his specialized treatment file, was being kept out of the room where he was dying. Alana's eyes locked on the red flashing vitals monitor through the frosted ICU glass. A part of her wanted to scream, to shove past the security and nurses, to do something. But a larger, sharper part, honed over 2 decades of emergency medicine, knew better. Panic kills clarity. Sir, she said, voice calm but direct, please contact Dr. Meredith Langley. She can confirm who I am. The guard shrugged, unmoved. We follow protocol, ma'am. You'll have to wait until we get verification. Until then, step aside. A sharp sigh echoed down the hallway as the far doors swung open. A woman in navy blue scrubs walked in with clipped, determined steps, Dr. Langley herself. She spotted Alana immediately and took just 1 second to understand what was unfolding. What the hell is going on here? Meredith snapped, eyes narrowing as she turned to the guard and the 2 nurses who had blocked the hallway. They fumbled, trying to explain security concerns, but she cut them off. She is Dr. Alana Brooks, Harvard Med, former trauma response director at Johns Hopkins, my colleague, and she has more clearance than most of you in this building. The tension in the hallway snapped like a rubber band. Some staff members stepped back. A few looked down at their feet. Others still stared, frozen. Alana said nothing. She walked past them all with the steady composure of someone who'd been here before, someone who had learned to face prejudice not with protest, but with poise. The ICU air was thick with antiseptic and urgency. Machines beeped in rhythmic panic. Her father lay unconscious, skin pale, chest struggling. A resident was fumbling with a syringe. A nurse hovered over the ventilator, clearly unsure. Alana took it in within 3 seconds. He's not responding to the dobutamine, she said flatly. Switch to milrinone and adjust the ventilator settings. He's overcompensating. Her voice wasn't loud, but it landed like an order. The resident paused, then nodded. Yes, doctor. In that moment, Alana wasn't someone mistaken for a janitor. She was the highest authority in the room, and everyone felt it. Each instruction she gave was carried out precisely. Every dosage, every adjustment, followed without question. Because here, beside a dying man, in the middle of a medical storm, credentials weren't worn, they were lived. And she saved his life. An hour later, Raymond Lee was stabilized. Alana exited the ICU, gloves still on, the collar of her coat damp with sweat. She said nothing to the staff she passed. She didn't have to. Her silence spoke louder than any accusation. But as she walked toward the lobby, she realized something had shifted. A small crowd had formed around the waiting room. People were staring at a phone screen. A video, recorded secretly during her confrontation with security, was now streaming on TikTok with the caption, "Black woman denied access to save her father at elite hospital." Views were skyrocketing. 38K, 41K, 45K. Hundreds of comments scrolled by in real time. "This is disgusting." "That's Dr. Brooks. I read her study in The Lancet." "Medical racism is real and dangerous." And then it spread. A local reporter, originally on site to cover a heart surgery initiative, was now live on Twitter. "We've confirmed the woman denied ICU access was Dr. Alana Brooks, a top trauma expert and former health department advisor. Sources say the patient inside was her own father." Her name, her face, her credentials. The internet was reacting. But that wasn't the moment everything changed. That moment came next, when the hospital intercom crackled to life. "All administrative staff, please report to conference room A for an emergency executive session." Alana looked up, her face unreadable. She knew exactly what that meant. A storm had just touched down, and she was standing at its center. As Alana waited for the secure call to go through, a chill ran through the ICU hallway, not from the air conditioning, but from the stares now directed at her. Some staff members lowered their eyes. Others glanced at her quickly and looked away. No one stepped forward to apologize. No one intervened. No one dared to challenge the unspoken hierarchy they were all upholding, the kind that assigns respect based on how someone looks rather than what they've done. This entire ordeal could have ended there. But then the double doors at the south wing burst open, and a woman in sharp navy scrubs entered with brisk, confident strides. Dr. Meredith Langley, chief of medicine at St. Victor Medical Center, walked in like someone used to wading through chaos. She had stood beside Alana during a 36-hour emergency deployment in flood-ravaged Louisiana. The moment she laid eyes on Alana standing outside the ICU, she didn't need an explanation. "What the hell is going on here?" she demanded, voice sharp as a scalpel. Her eyes snapped toward the security guard and the two nurses who had positioned themselves like gatekeepers. They began to explain, fumbling with words like security and verification. But Meredith cut them off with a raised hand. "This is Dr. Alana Brooks, Harvard Med, former trauma response director at Johns Hopkins. She's my colleague, and she has higher clearance than anyone in this hallway." The atmosphere shifted immediately. Some staff backed away. Others froze, unsure whether to speak or disappear. Alana didn't react. She walked past them in silence, her expression unreadable, her steps deliberate. It wasn't pride. It wasn't revenge. It was what years of being underestimated had taught her. Let your knowledge speak louder than your anger. The ICU air hit her like a wall, thick with antiseptic, electricity, and the sound of human fragility. The heart monitor was screaming in sharp bursts. Raymond Lee, her adoptive father and former hospital executive, lay pale and motionless, his chest struggling to rise and fall. A young resident stood stiffly by the monitor, fumbling with a dosage pump. A nurse hovered nervously over the ventilator settings, uncertain and overwhelmed. Alana didn't hesitate. "He's not responding to dobutamine," she said, scanning the vitals. "Switch to milrinone and recalibrate the ventilator. He's compensating too hard." Her tone was calm but commanding, her words slicing through the fog of hesitation. The resident hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, doctor." And just like that, the room snapped into motion. Orders were followed. Adjustments were made. Nobody asked for her ID. Nobody questioned her presence. Because in that room, beside a man fighting to breathe, there was no time for doubt, only for decisions. And Alana was the only one who knew exactly what to do. An hour later, Raymond Lee was stable, breathing on his own, monitors quiet. The storm had passed. Alana stepped out of the ICU. Sweat clung to the collar of her coat, gloves still on her hands. She didn't look at the staff waiting outside. She didn't speak to them. She didn't need to. Her silence carried the weight of everything they had failed to say. But something had changed. As she walked through the waiting area, she noticed a crowd had gathered. People were clustered around a smartphone. A video was playing, a grainy recording from earlier, showing her being blocked from entering the ICU. The title read, "Black Doctor Denied Access to Save Her Own Father at Elite Boston Hospital." The views were climbing, 38,000, 41,000, 45,000, rising every second. Hundreds of comments were pouring in. "Unbelievable. That's Dr. Brooks from the Lancet article. This is why we need accountability in healthcare." But it didn't stop there. A local news reporter, who had come to the hospital that day to cover a heart health grant, had witnessed the entire confrontation and was now live streaming on Twitter. Her voice was steady, but charged. "We've just confirmed that the woman denied ICU access was Dr. Alana Brooks, a nationally recognized trauma expert and former Department of Health advisor. The patient inside the ICU was her adoptive father, and she was denied entry for over 20 minutes. Alana's name, face, and credentials were no longer just known. They were viral. Her story was igniting a fire. And then the public address system chimed overhead. "All administrative staff, please report to Conference Room A for an emergency executive session." Alana stopped walking. She looked up at the ceiling speakers, then at the faces around her. She knew exactly what that announcement meant. An internal fire alarm had just been pulled at the highest level of hospital leadership. She had been on the inside of such meetings. She had called for them herself in the past. But now she was the reason for this one. The system had made a choice to block her, and now it would answer for it. But this wasn't just about her anymore. It was bigger than one mistake. The story was no longer a moment. It was a movement. And at the heart of that movement was a woman who had tried to save a life and been stopped because she didn't look the part. The executive boardroom on the 5th floor of St. Victor Medical Center hadn't seen urgency like this in years. Staff badges were scanned in rapid succession as hospital administrators, department heads, and legal counsel filed into the room under fluorescent lights. The doors closed behind them with a final sounding click. For most of them, this was supposed to be a regular Tuesday. Instead, they were now sitting at a polished mahogany table facing a crisis with teeth. Meanwhile, just 2 floors below, Dr. Alana Brooks sat quietly in the private family consultation room adjacent to the ICU. Her hands were clasped together, resting on her knees. Her phone buzzed with messages, most of which she ignored. National news outlets were already trying to contact her. Someone had posted a thread identifying her credentials in detail. Harvard Medical, top of her class. Johns Hopkins Trauma Leadership Program. UN Medical Envoy in Syria and Sudan. And of course, her advisory role with the Department of Health. But none of those titles meant anything when she had been stopped at the door. None of them mattered when her father could have died while she was forced to argue her way through a hallway. It wasn't just rage simmering under her skin. It was exhaustion. The kind that builds after years of being questioned, tested, doubted, and disregarded. Across the hall, hospital staff were scrambling to contain the damage. Legal counsel pulled up policies. The public relations director whispered furiously into her phone. They were too late. The story had outpaced them. Twitter was trending. TikTok was boiling. Dr. Brooks and her medical racism had let her save lives. At that very moment, a Zoom link was being projected onto the large screen in the executive boardroom. On the other end was the hospital's board chair, dialing in from New York. "We are now aware of a highly publicized incident involving Dr. Alana Brooks," she began. "It appears we may have violated both internal access protocols and exposed ourselves to serious reputational and legal risk." Someone in the room tried to shift blame to the ICU staff, but the chairwoman cut them off. "Let's be clear. This isn't just about individual conduct. It's about the failure of an entire system to recognize one of its own. You had a board-certified trauma physician, someone who helped design the ICU you're working in, being blocked by people who never even asked for credentials." In the room, silence fell like snow. But downstairs the storm wasn't finished. The lobby had transformed. More reporters were arriving. A camera crew was setting up by the main entrance. Hospital volunteers were awkwardly trying to hand out brochures, hoping to distract from the growing spectacle. But it was pointless. The story had already become bigger than the building itself. Back in the consultation room, a knock interrupted Alana's stillness. The door creaked open, and in stepped Meredith Langley. She looked tired, her normally perfect posture slightly wilted. "They want to speak with you," she said softly. "Upstairs." Alana met her gaze. "And what do they want to hear, Meredith? That I forgive them? That I say the system just needs a little tweaking?" Meredith didn't answer right away. "I don't think they know what they want, Alana. I think they just realized the house is on fire, and you're the only one holding a hose." Alana stood, straightened her coat. "Then let's talk." When she entered the boardroom, the air changed. Half the room stood instinctively. The other half fidgeted in their seats. The chairwoman's voice came through the speaker. "Dr. Brooks, thank you for joining us. We understand you have been through a great deal today." Alana didn't sit. "You understand very little. But I'm here to help you understand more." A beat of awkward silence passed. Then she began. "Today, I arrived at this hospital not as a board advisor or a donor or a national fellow. I came as a daughter. My father was crashing. I had been called in specifically to assist with his care. And I was stopped, dismissed, judged, and humiliated because I didn't look the part, because I wasn't wearing the white coat or speaking with the assumed tone, because I am a black woman in sneakers and a leather jacket." No one interrupted her. Not a single voice attempted to defend or deflect. She continued, "What happened to me today is not rare. It is common. Common in medicine, common in airports, in boardrooms, in banks. But what makes this different is that this hospital, this institution, is supposed to know better. You talk about equality, about diversity, about equity and inclusion, but none of that matters if your frontline staff only recognize authority when it wears a certain look." The chairwoman tried to pivot. "Dr. Brooks, I assure you, this is not who we are." "But it is," Alana replied flatly. "It is who you are, until you change what you do." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, documents she had already prepared before arriving. She placed it in front of the hospital COO. "This is a list of 5 actions, not suggestions, not polite requests, conditions. Want all. Mandatory anti-bias and cultural competency training for all front-facing staff within 30 days. 2. The creation of an anonymous reporting system for patients and staff who experience discrimination, managed by a third-party firm. 3. A public apology acknowledging what happened here and who was responsible. 4. Direct consequences for the employees involved. And 5. She paused, looking around the room. A $500,000 fund set aside for long-term equity initiatives, including scholarships, community health access programs, and patient advocacy services. One of the legal reps muttered something about liability. Alana looked him dead in the eye. "You're already liable. The live streams are evidence. The media coverage is national. The question isn't whether you're at risk, it's whether you'll face it with integrity or cowardice." For a moment, no one moved. Then Meredith Langley cleared her throat. "I support all 5 measures," she said, standing. Slowly, others followed. Some nodded, some murmured their agreement. But the room was shifting. Power was no longer at the head of the table. It was standing in front of it. And her name was Dr. Alana Brooks. By the time Dr. Alana Brooks stepped out of the boardroom, the hospital had fully transformed from a place of quiet professionalism into the epicenter of a very public reckoning. The local media presence had doubled, with vans from major Boston news outlets now parked outside, satellite dishes spinning slowly in the late afternoon sun. Inside the hospital, staff moved with visible discomfort, unsure whether to make eye contact with her or pretend she wasn't there. Alana had seen this before. Not the cameras, not the trending hashtags, but the shifting atmosphere that always followed truth being dragged into the light. People didn't know whether to apologize, congratulate, or avoid her, so most did nothing at all. She walked past them calmly, her presence now undeniable, her authority no longer questioned. Meredith caught up to her halfway down the corridor. The board voted to approve all 5 points. They'll draft the formal statements tonight. Public release scheduled for tomorrow morning. Alana gave a small nod. "Good. That's a start." Meredith hesitated. "You do know this is going to spread further than the hospital, right?" Alana didn't answer right away. She stopped beside the row of lobby chairs, watching the news ticker on the screen above the front desk. Her face was there now, beside the headline, "Renowned Trauma Surgeon Denied ICU Access in Alleged Racial Profiling Incident." Underneath, the subtext rolled, "Dr. Alana Brooks, National Advisor and Johns Hopkins alum, speaks out after being blocked from aiding critically ill father." She turned back to Meredith. "It already has." Outside, the crowd had spilled beyond the front sidewalk. Students from local universities had begun to gather, many holding signs, "Let her save lives," and "Credentials over color." Several civil rights attorneys had shown up without invitation, speaking to reporters on the record about the potential implications for Title VI violations. One attorney, visibly emotional, said, "If this can happen to a decorated trauma surgeon, imagine what happens to patients of color who have no title, no voice, no way to prove their worth in a moment of crisis." Meanwhile, online traffic surged. A former patient of Alana's posted a video recounting how Alana had performed a life-saving chest decompression on him mid-flight 5 years ago. His video went viral within hours. A clip of her giving a TEDx talk on bias in the trauma bay had resurfaced and racked up over 1 million views. What had started as a confrontation at a single hospital door had ignited a nationwide conversation. That night, Alana sat alone in her apartment in Cambridge, watching as major news networks debated her story. On CNN, a panel of medical ethicists and civil rights experts dissected the incident frame by frame. On MSNBC, a scroll at the bottom of the screen read, "Dr. Brooks calls for systemic change. Hospital begins implementation of emergency equity protocols." But what caught her off guard was the segment on PBS. A host read from a viewer email, "I'm a white male ER doctor in rural Georgia. I watched the video of Dr. Brooks, and I realized I've looked right past colleagues who didn't look like they belonged. I'm ashamed, and I'm thankful for her strength. She changed the way I see my own bias." Alana closed her laptop and sat in silence. It wasn't validation she sought. It was progress. The next morning, her phone rang at 6:02 a.m. Patricia Vance, Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, was on the line. "Alana, it's Patricia. I wanted to reach out personally. I saw everything. The president has been briefed." Alana exhaled slowly. "I didn't intend for any of this to become a national spectacle." "And yet it needed to," Patricia said. "We're convening a healthcare equity task force. I want you on it. And frankly, I want you leading it." Alana said nothing for a moment. "Let me think about it. I have a few more fires to put out here first." Later that afternoon, St. Victor Medical Center issued its formal apology. The statement read, "We acknowledge that Dr. Alana Brooks was denied access to a patient in critical condition due to the failure of our staff to follow proper verification procedures and due to implicit bias. We take full responsibility for the pain and danger caused by this failure and are committed to immediate and long-term systemic change." The hospital not only agreed to Alana's 5 conditions, but expanded them. They committed to implementing the new protocols across their entire network of facilities statewide. They also invited her to return in a consulting capacity, an offer she declined. "I don't want a title," she said in a follow-up interview with The Atlantic. "I want a standard." A few days later, the ripple effect became undeniable. 3 other hospitals in the Boston area began reviewing their own access and discrimination policies. Then it spread to New York, Philadelphia, Chicago. Medical boards across the country began holding emergency meetings. Hospital HR departments rushed to review employee training standards. Alana's story was no longer just news. It was precedent. Back in Cambridge, she found herself flooded with letters. Hundreds. From patients, medical students, nurses, and even janitorial staff. One stood out. It was from a high school student in Detroit named Jordan Taylor. "Dr. Brooks," it read, "I saw your story. I've always wanted to be a doctor, but people like me, I don't see them in those coats. I didn't think I could ever belong. But now I know I was wrong. Thank you for walking through that door, even when they tried to keep you out." Alana folded the letter gently, slid it into her desk drawer, and looked out the window. The sky over the Charles River was pale blue and streaked with early spring clouds. She had been in the field for over 20 years. She had worked in war zones, in disaster sites, in overwhelmed ERs. But nothing had shaken her like being told, without question, without hesitation, that she didn't belong. And yet, because she had documented it, because she had stood her ground without raising her voice, because the world had seen her calm, firm refusal to be erased, things were changing. As she turned away from the window, her phone buzzed again. A major healthcare coalition wanted to license her 5-point protocol nationally. NBC was preparing a primetime special on the incident. A documentary filmmaker had requested an interview, but what mattered more to her was the email from a medical school dean in Alabama. They were naming a new scholarship, the Dr. Alana Brooks Equity in Medicine Award. That was the real win, not the headlines, not the hashtags, but the fact that one day, a black woman in sneakers and a leather jacket could walk into an ICU without being stopped, not because people recognized her name, but because systems had finally been taught to recognize her worth. Within just 10 days of the incident at St. Victor Medical Center, a formal legislative inquiry had been announced by the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. The language was blunt. A nationally recognized trauma physician was denied access to a critical care unit because of how she looked. If this can happen in a top-tier institution, it can happen anywhere. We must investigate. Dr. Alana Brooks was no longer just a name in a trending hashtag. She had become the symbol of a long-ignored truth, that racial bias, even unspoken, could endanger lives and undermine entire systems of care. Her image, professional, composed, never seeking pity, had been replayed across every major media outlet. But it wasn't the headlines that kept the public engaged. It was the consistency of her tone. She didn't yell. She didn't accuse. She simply stated facts with clarity and let the evidence speak. That calm, controlled energy became a blueprint. Hospitals across the country began requesting her 5-point protocol. Within 3 weeks, over 200 institutions had signed a pledge to adopt or adapt the system. The American Medical Association issued a statement in full support, citing her model as a scalable, measurable response to implicit bias in patient care and physician treatment. But behind the scenes, Alana stayed grounded. She declined most speaking engagements, accepted only a few interviews, and continued spending her days consulting with hospital equity teams, reviewing case reports, and offering guidance to administrators trying, some earnestly, some just to save face, to clean house before public pressure came knocking. What most people didn't know was that Alana was also documenting every piece of it, every hospital that reached out, every board vote, every new policy enacted. Her foundation team, which had been modest before, now grew into a full-time staff of attorneys, data analysts, and field researchers. They weren't just riding a media wave, they were building an archive that could one day serve as legal precedent if institutions backslid once the cameras moved on. On the 42nd day after the incident, she stood in front of the Department of Health and Human Services, flanked by Patricia Vance and Surgeon General Miguel Ortega. Together, they unveiled the National Medical Equity Framework, a federal policy initiative designed to combat discrimination in healthcare access and workforce treatment. Alana's fingerprints were all over the plan, from the language in the bias training modules to the digital dashboard that would publicly display hospital equity scores. The event was broadcast live. In her brief speech, Alana said, "This isn't about making people comfortable. It's about making people accountable. The future of healthcare must be driven by equity, not assumption. Every patient, every provider, every institution." The applause was polite, but the impact was seismic. Within 2 months, Medicaid and Medicare revised their reimbursement standards to include equity metrics. Hospitals were told clearly, improve your treatment of staff and patients across racial and gender lines, or risk losing federal funding. It was the kind of policy shift that no press release could fake. Administrators scrambled. Private health systems invested in external audits. Some even began tying executive bonuses to equity outcomes. Exactly the kind of structural change Alana had pushed for. But as the professional world evolved, the personal world caught up too. One evening, Alana returned home to find a small envelope waiting in her mailbox. No return address. Inside was a folded sheet of lined paper and a photograph. The photo was old, grainy. 2 little girls on a playground, one white, one black, both in matching hospital volunteer smocks. The letter read, "I think this was us. St. Francis, 1989. My name is Lily. I was one of those girls who always got praised more than you, even when you did the same work. You probably don't remember me, but I remember you, and I've been watching everything you're doing now. Thank you for never quitting." Alana held the photo for a long moment. She did remember, and somehow that memory meant more than all the panels, all the policies, all the politics. It was proof that change could reach across decades and still touch someone enough to write. The following week, her team launched a national portal, docjustice.org, a reporting tool, legal resource, and training center for medical professionals experiencing bias or being silenced. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of doctors, nurses, med students, even administrative staff submitted their stories. Some wrote about being denied leadership roles. Others shared how patients had refused their care based on race or gender, and how supervisors told them to just ignore it. One message came from a Vietnamese ER nurse in Texas who had been mocked by colleagues for her accent. Another came from a Native American med student who'd been told she was only here for the diversity numbers. Alana's team didn't just read these stories, They responded. They offered support, connected people to attorneys, provided emotional care liaisons, and when appropriate, they began compiling cases for collective legal action. Meanwhile, the federal government began inviting Alana into rooms she'd once only dreamed of, roundtables with NIH, advisory councils with the CDC, think tanks planning the future of AI and bias detection in clinical settings. She showed up to all of them the same way. No suit, no fanfare, just her notebook, her questions, and her unwillingness to let policy get lost in politics. But despite the momentum, she knew it was fragile. Progress often is. That's why, in every meeting, every panel, every speech, she returned to the same phrase: "This isn't about me. It's about the next one." Because somewhere, even now, another doctor was being ignored, another nurse was being talked down to, another patient was being misjudged before they even spoke, and that, Alana knew, would not change unless people in power were held to new standards, over and over again, not because they feared going viral, but because they finally understood that dignity wasn't optional. It was essential. By the time autumn arrived in Boston, the movement Alana had ignited had spread far beyond hospitals and policy briefings. It had taken root in culture, in conversations between coworkers, in the revised language of HR manuals, and in the silences that people began noticing more often. One such silence happened on a Tuesday morning in the staff lounge of St. Victor Medical Center, almost 6 months to the day since the incident. A group of nurses were having coffee, laughing about weekend plans, when a new hire, a quiet black nurse named Naomi, walked in. The room fell briefly silent. It wasn't malicious, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real, the kind of moment that once would have passed unnoticed, unspoken. But this time, someone did speak. An older nurse named Diane, who had worked at the hospital for nearly 20 years, looked around the room and said, "That's not the kind of silence we do anymore." Then she stood, pulled out a chair, and invited Naomi to sit. That was what change looked like. Not grand, not televised, but practiced. It wasn't always easy. In the months following Alana's case, the hospital faced its share of pushback. A handful of employees quit rather than participate in the new training. One senior administrator filed a quiet complaint, alleging that the culture was becoming too sensitive. That complaint didn't go anywhere, not because it was ignored, but because when reviewed against the new standards, it was clear the real issue wasn't oversensitivity. It was finally being asked to behave differently. Under new leadership and regular oversight from an external equity review board, St. Victor had changed. The access protocols had been rebuilt. The security team received not just diversity training, but scenario-based role-play sessions guided by former patients and frontline providers of color. The anonymous reporting system had logged 47 reports in the first 60 days. But here's what surprised everyone. Most of them were not about overt discrimination. They were about microaggressions, language, assumption. A doctor calling a Latina nurse "sweetheart" in front of a patient. A receptionist consistently mispronouncing a Nigerian surname despite being corrected multiple times. These weren't headlines, but they were the roots of what had almost destroyed the credibility of a world-class hospital. And now, they were being pulled out, patiently, systematically. Alana continued her work through the foundation, speaking at select events, meeting with students, and consulting on national policy. But she rarely returned to St. Victor, not because she resented them. She didn't. She believed in their ability to grow, but the wound was still fresh. It was still hard to walk through those doors without remembering how her father's life had hung in the balance while her identity had been questioned. Then one afternoon, she received an email with the subject line, "I was there that day." It was from Sarah Kingsley, the nurse who had first whispered that Alana looked like a janitor. The message was long, apologetic, vulnerable. Sarah wrote about how she'd grown up in a small town in New Hampshire, raised to believe she was colorblind, proud of being a good person. But after watching herself in that now viral video, she had been forced to confront the truth. She hadn't been colorblind. She had been willfully blind. She wrote, "I didn't recognize you that day, not because you were unfamiliar, but because my image of who belongs in power never included someone who looked like you. And that's on me." The email ended with an invitation. Sarah had transferred to a new hospital and was leading a bias reduction workshop. She wanted Alana to attend, not as a speaker, not as a guest of honor, but just as someone in the room. Alana sat with the email for nearly a week. Then quietly, she said yes. When she entered the hospital auditorium where the training was held, no one clapped. No one made a fuss. Sarah introduced her simply as Dr. Brooks, here to observe. And observe she did. For 2 hours she listened as nurses, techs, and administrative staff unpacked their assumptions, challenged each other, and most importantly, listened. At the end, Sarah stood beside her, hands visibly shaking. "Dr. Brooks," she said, "I can't undo what I said that day, but I can make sure I never repeat it, and I can teach others not to repeat it either." Alana didn't smile. She didn't need to. She just nodded once. That's what matters. That evening, as she walked through the hospital parking lot under a pale November sky, Alana felt something shift. Not resolve. That had always been there. But peace. The kind of peace that comes when you realize your story has outgrown your pain, when what was once a wound becomes a bridge. Not a clean one, not perfect, but strong enough to hold the next person walking behind you. 2 years after the day she was stopped outside the ICU, Dr. Alana Brooks stood at a podium beneath the domed ceiling of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. The room was packed, not with reporters or politicians this time, but with medical students, hospital interns, public health advocates, and quiet faces from community clinics across the country. She wasn't there for an award. She had declined several already. She was there to deliver the keynote for the annual Healthcare Equity Summit, which now bore a new subtitle beneath its logo, "Inspired by the Case of Dr. Alana Brooks." As she looked out over the audience, she recognized faces from every part of her journey. There was Patricia Vance from the Department of Health, Naomi, the nurse from St. Victor, Jordan Taylor, now a third-year pre-med student who had flown in from Detroit on a scholarship funded by the very hospital that once ignored doctors who looked like her. Even Sarah Kingsley was there, seated near the back, still quiet, still present. Alana adjusted the microphone, took a breath, and began, not with statistics, not with policy language, but with a memory. 2 years ago, I was told I didn't belong in a place I had helped build, she said. I wasn't new. I wasn't unqualified. I simply didn't fit what some people believed a doctor should look like. And because of that, I was blocked from doing my job, from helping my own father. That moment changed my life. But more importantly, it helped expose a truth that many of us already knew. Bias, especially in medicine, isn't always loud. It's often quiet, casual, dismissed as misunderstanding or protocol, but it can be just as deadly. She didn't speak with anger. Her tone was steady, measured, the way it had always been, cutting through noise not by raising volume, but by offering clarity. What we've done since that day is more than react. We've rebuilt, we've retrained, we've rewritten the rules. Hospitals now track bias reports with the same rigor they use to track infections. Patient access is no longer judged by perception, but by policy. And medical staff from underrepresented backgrounds are no longer treated as anomalies, but as essential. The audience listened in pin-drop silence. But here's what I want every future doctor in this room to know. she continued. Real change doesn't come from a viral video. It comes from how you treat people when no one is recording, when no one is watching. It's in the moments where you choose to challenge a colleague's joke or pronounce a name correctly even if it's difficult, or ask the quietest person in the room what they think. It's not glamorous work. It's daily work. It's choosing equity as a discipline, not a press release. She paused, scanning the room. And for anyone who's ever been made to feel invisible, your voice matters. Your presence matters. Your story might not trend, but it might change someone, and that's enough. After her speech, no standing ovation came immediately. It wasn't that kind of moment. People sat still, absorbing, processing. And then it came, softly at first, then swelling until the entire hall stood to their feet. Alana nodded once, quietly, and stepped back from the podium. She didn't need the applause. Her work spoke loud enough. As the event came to a close, a young girl, no older than 10, approached her with a small drawing in hand. It showed a stick-figure woman in a white coat, standing in front of a hospital, with the words in crayon, "I want to be like you." Alana knelt, took the drawing gently, and said, "You'll be better." That night, as she walked out under the lights of Washington, D.C., the air cool and quiet, Alana didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a bridge, built by pain, strengthened by truth, and walked on now by hundreds, maybe thousands, who might finally reach places they were once told they didn't belong. And that, more than any podium or policy, was the legacy she cared to leave behind.